In the early light of a Virginia morning in 1850, the cotton fields of Prince William County stretched endlessly, their dew-soaked rows glistening under a hesitant sun. But within the weathered walls of a small wooden cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. Agnes, a black woman bound by the brutal chains of slavery, had endured years of torment at the hands of her master, Gerald Mason. His cruelty was relentless. Whips that scarred her back, insults that cut deeper than any lash, and hands that left marks no one could see. That morning, as faint sunlight slipped through the cracks of her cabin, Agnes stood in the dim kitchen, her fingers wrapped around a worn knife. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear anymore, it was resolve. When her scream shattered the stillness, it wasn't just a cry of defiance. It was the sound of a woman refusing to let her humanity be crushed. Born into a world where freedom was a whispered myth, Agnes's life was a testament to survival. Her story, one of unimaginable hardship and unyielding courage, isn't just history, it's a spark of resistance that still burns, daring us to listen and learn. In the sweltering heat of a Virginia summer in the 1830s, Agnes came into the world not with a mother's lullaby but with the cold scratch of a plantation ledger marking her as property. Born on a sprawling estate in Prince William County, her first breath was claimed not by love but by the brutal machinery of slavery. There was no cradle, no tender moments of childhood wonder. From the moment her small feet could carry her, they were set to work in the cotton fields, her tiny hands learning the rough texture of bowls before they ever held a toy. By age 5, she was already a laborer, her days measured not by play but by the relentless rhythm of survival. The plantation was her universe, a world where the sun rose to signal toil and set to offer only exhaustion. The crack of the overseer's whip was her earliest lullaby, a sound that echoed through her youth, reminding her that her life was not her own. Childhood, for Agnes, was not a season of innocence but a cruel disguise for endless labor, a truth that hardened her heart early. The women around Agnes, those weathered souls in the slave quarters, carried burdens heavier than the baskets of cotton they hauled. They were mothers who could not shield their children from the auction block, daughters who learned too young that their bodies were as much a commodity as their labor. Agnes watched them, her young eyes absorbing their silent endurance. She saw how they lowered their gazes when the master's shadow crossed the threshold, how they swallowed their cries when children were torn from their arms and sold to distant plantations. Silence became their shield, the only defense against a world that sought to strip them of everything. Agnes learned this lesson quickly. When the overseer's boots thudded closer, she bit her lip, letting the pain of silence protect her from worse. When bruises bloomed across her skin, she buried her anger, knowing that to speak was to invite more punishment. Yet, in the quiet of the night, when the fields lay still, she saw the cost of that silence. A mother's wail stifled by fear, a sister's spirit broken by violation. It was a lesson in survival, but also in the fragility of hope. Even in this darkness, faint whispers of freedom flickered like fireflies. At night, around the dim glow of embers in the cramped cabins, the elders spoke in hushed tones of a world beyond the plantation's borders. They told tales of a place where no whip cracked, where families were not torn apart, where a person could stand tall without fear of a master's wrath. Agnes, barely a teenager, clung to these stories like a lifeline. She couldn't picture freedom's shape. It was too vast, too impossible, but its echo lodged in her chest, a quiet pulse that refused to fade. These whispers were dangerous, forbidden, yet they were the only light in her world of shadows. They spoke of runaways who slipped through the woods, of distant lands where black folks walked free. Agnes listened, her heart catching on every word, even as she knew the risks of dreaming too loudly. Those stories were her first taste of defiance, planting seeds that would one day grow into something unbreakable. As Agnes grew into womanhood, her life became a relentless cycle of suffering. Dawn broke with the overseer's horn, dragging her from a thin pallet on the cabin floor to the fields. The work was grueling, hours bent under a merciless sun, picking cotton until her fingers bled, her back aching with a pain that no rest could soothe. By nightfall, she often collapsed without even kicking off her worn shoes, her body too weary to care. Scars crisscrossed her back, each one a story of punishment for a dropped tool, a slow step, or simply the whim of an overseer. Food was scarce, a meager ration of cornmeal or scraps that barely fueled her for the next day's labor. Winter was no kinder. The thin walls of her cabin let in the biting cold, and the scars on her skin burned as if the whip had just fallen. Yet, even in this unyielding grind, Agnes nurtured a quiet strength. The world told her she was nothing, a tool, a shadow, but she refused to believe it. Her silence was not surrender. It was a mask, hiding a fire that grew with every lash. Beneath the weight of her suffering, Agnes was forging something powerful. Each insult, each blow, each stolen moment of rest was not erasing her but etching her resolve. By 1850, in her late 20s, she had lived long enough under the chains of slavery to understand a profound truth. The human spirit could bend, it could hide, but it could not be extinguished. The plantation's cruelty was designed to break her, to reduce her to a husk of compliance, but it failed. Every scar on her body was a mark of survival, every silenced cry a testament to her endurance. She was not weak, though the overseers mocked her as such. She was not voiceless, though her words were stolen. In the hollow of her silence, a storm was gathering, a defiance that grew stronger with every indignity. Agnes was not just surviving, she was becoming something the plantation could not contain. Her soul, tempered by years of pain, was a blade being sharpened, waiting for the moment when it would finally cut free. This was Agnes's world, a life written in pain, but underlined with an unyielding will. To the entrepreneurs, freelancers, and creators watching, her story is a reminder of resilience in the face of impossible odds. Like you, Agnes faced a system stacked against her, yet she found strength in the quiet moments, in the whispers of possibility. Her courage wasn't loud or flashy. It was forged in the daily grind, in the choice to keep going when everything screamed to give up. Her life, though bound by chains, speaks to anyone who's ever fought to carve their own path, to build something from nothing, to hold on to hope when the world offers none. In the rolling hills of Prince William County, Virginia, in 1850, Gerald Mason stood as a towering figure of wealth and influence, his name carrying the weight of respect among the white landowners who shared his world. To them, he was a successful planter, a man whose sprawling estate and numerous enslaved laborers testified to his prosperity. But to those who toiled under his iron grip, Mason was not a man but a specter of terror, his presence a constant reminder of their powerlessness. To Agnes, the black woman who lived under his shadow, he was not just a master but a force of unrelenting cruelty, a man who wore his brutality like a badge of honor. Mason didn't see Agnes or the others as human beings. They were tools, property to be used or discarded at his whim. His plantation, with its neat rows of cotton and grand white house, was a kingdom where he ruled as a tyrant, his every word law, his every mood a potential storm. Mason's cruelty was not a secret, it was a performance. When neighbors or business associates visited his plantation, he delighted in showcasing his dominance, turning the suffering of those he enslaved into a twisted form of entertainment. He'd call Agnes or others to stand before his guests, mocking their tattered clothes or weary postures, his laughter sharp and cutting. Talking tools, he'd call them, stripping away their humanity with a grin, as if their pain were a punchline. Agnes, often singled out, bore the brunt of his scorn. Her silence, her lowered eyes seemed to provoke him, as if her endurance challenged his authority. He mistook her quiet for weakness, never suspecting the strength she was forging beneath it. To Mason, humiliating Agnes in front of others was a sport, a way to flex his power and remind everyone, enslaved and free alike, who held the reins. His guests, sipping whiskey on the wide porch, would chuckle nervously, some joining in to avoid his wrath, their laughter a second lash across Agnes's dignity. But Mason's cruelty wasn't limited to words. It was etched into the very air of the plantation. His boots on the wooden floorboards sent a chill through the cabins, a sound that signaled danger as surely as a rattlesnake's hiss. For Agnes, those footsteps were a warning of what was to come, a raised hand, a shouted insult, or worse, an uninvited touch that left her feeling like her body was no longer her own. Mason's violence was both physical and psychological, a calculated assault on both flesh and spirit. He'd force Agnes to stand still while he berated her, comparing her to livestock, his words designed to strip away any sense of worth. If she faltered in her work, perhaps dropping a utensil or pausing to catch her breath, punishment was swift. A whip across her back, a slap to her face, or hours without food, all delivered with a smirk that said her suffering was his pleasure. Mason thrived on fear, believing it was the glue that held his empire together, the force that kept his laborers in line. Yet, what Mason never grasped was that fear, when pushed to its limits, could transform into something far more dangerous. Each blow he landed on Agnes, each insult he hurled, didn't break her, it carved her resolve deeper. To him, she was invisible unless she was serving his needs, a shadow moving through his kitchen or fields. But to Agnes, Mason was an inescapable specter, his cruelty haunting every corner of her existence. His arrogance blinded him to the truth that his actions were not erasing her spirit but fueling it. He believed himself untouchable, a king in his own domain, never imagining that the quiet woman he mocked was learning to see through his power. Every time he raised his hand, every time he laughed at her pain, he was unknowingly forging the weapon that would one day turn against him. Mason's tyranny was built on a delusion that his cruelty made him invincible. He saw Agnes's silence as proof of his dominance, never suspecting the storm brewing behind her downcast eyes. To the entrepreneurs, freelancers, and creators watching this story unfold, Mason's arrogance is a cautionary tale. Like a toxic boss or a cutthroat competitor, he underestimated the resilience of those he sought to control. Agnes's story resonates with anyone who's faced a seemingly unbeatable obstacle, a system, a person, or a circumstance that feels designed to crush you. Mason thought he could break Agnes, but he didn't see the strength she was building in the shadows. His cruelty, meant to keep her small, only sharpened her will. In his blindness, he sowed the seeds of his own undoing, proving that no power is absolute when it's built on the suffering of others. For those building businesses or chasing dreams, Agnes's story is a reminder. Underestimating the quiet strength of the overlooked can be a fatal mistake. In the suffocating grip of Virginia's winter of 1850, Agnes's life on Gerald Mason's plantation had become a crucible of suffering, each day forging her resolve a little sharper. The endless cycle of labor, hunger, and humiliation under Mason's cruel hand had not broken her spirit but tempered it, like steel in a fire. Beneath her silence, a quiet defiance was taking root, fed by years of scars and whispered dreams of freedom. Every insult Mason hurled, every lash that marked her back, was a spark, and Agnes was no longer just enduring, she was preparing. She moved through her tasks with a mechanical precision, her hands steady as they worked the fields or scrubbed the kitchen, but her mind was no longer bound by the chains that held her body. The world saw a silent, obedient woman, but inside, Agnes was gathering the strength to rewrite her story, to reclaim the humanity Mason had tried to erase. Mason's cruelty was a daily ritual, but it was his public displays of power that cut deepest. He thrived on humiliating Agnes in front of others, summoning her to the main house during gatherings of his peers, where he'd mock her torn clothes or exhausted frame. "Look at this one," he'd sneer, his voice dripping with contempt as his guests chuckled, their laughter a blade that sliced through Agnes's dignity. The plantation's wooden porch became a stage for his cruelty, each taunt a performance to prove his dominance. Agnes stood still, her eyes lowered, absorbing the shame, but each word carved a deeper line of resolve in her heart. The other enslaved workers, forced to witness these scenes, could only bow their heads, their silence a shared shield against Mason's wrath. Yet, for Agnes, these moments were not just pain, they were fuel. The laughter of strangers, the smirk on Mason's face, the weight of their gazes, all of it was building towards something inevitable. The breaking point came on a frostbitten morning in early winter, when the fields were dusted with ice and the air stung with cold. Agnes, working in the kitchen, dropped a wooden spoon, a small mistake that would have gone unnoticed in any other world. But Mason, always eager for an excuse, stormed into the quarters, his boots pounding the floorboards like a war drum. "Animal!" he spat, his voice echoing through the cramped space as he struck her across the face. The blow was sharp, but it was his words, laced with venom, that burned deeper. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her cheek, mocking her in front of the others, his laughter joined by nervous chuckles from the onlookers. The word animal hung in the air, a wound that cut through years of suppressed rage. For Agnes, it was not just an insult, it was the final straw, the moment when silence could no longer hold her fury. The humiliation crystallized every scar, every stolen moment, into a single, searing truth: she could endure no more. That night, as the plantation slept under a blanket of frost, Agnes sat alone by the faint glow of a dying fire. The kitchen knife lay on the rough wooden table, its blade catching the flicker of embers. She ran her fingers over its worn handle, her hands trembling not with fear but with the weight of a decision that had been years in the making. Each scar on her back seemed to whisper, each insult replayed in her mind, merging into a chorus of enough. She wasn't driven by rage alone but by a desperate need to reclaim something Mason had stolen: her humanity. The knife wasn't just steel, it was a symbol of her refusal to be erased. As she stared into the fire, her breath uneven, her heart pounded like a drum calling her to destiny. The decision was made, not in haste but in the quiet clarity of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Dawn broke, painting the kitchen walls with pale streaks of gold. Agnes moved through her morning tasks with a calm that belied the storm within. She prepared Mason's breakfast as she had countless times, but today was different. Her resolve had hardened overnight, set like iron cooling after the forge. Mason entered the kitchen with his usual swagger, his boots striking the floor with the rhythm of dominance. He cast his gaze on Agnes, already seeking a flaw to exploit. "Clumsy," he sneered, his voice a familiar taunt as he called her worthless, less than human. But this time, Agnes didn't lower her eyes. She stood taller, her breast steady, her hands resting not in submission but in readiness. The knife, within reach, waited in silence, its steel a mirror to her resolve. Her heart thundered, not with fear but with the awakening of courage. As Mason stepped closer, his sneer twisting into a cruel grin, Agnes's grip tightened on the knife. Years of humiliation pressed into this singular moment, an act that would either end her life or redeem it. She thought of the nights she'd endured, the scars that mapped her body, the dignity he tried to crush. When he reached toward her, his hand heavy with intent, she moved. The strike was swift, a sharp sound of steel meeting flesh, followed by a silence heavier than any Mason had ever commanded. His body faltered, the arrogance draining from his eyes, replaced by a fleeting disbelief. Then came the collapse, a thud that echoed like the fall of a tyrant. Agnes stood frozen, her chest heaving as if she'd run a marathon, though she hadn't moved more than a step. The knife slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor, and she pressed her palm to her chest, steadying her racing heart. In that moment, the world shifted. The kitchen, once a prison of her labor, became a stage for her liberation. A scream tore from her throat, not of fear or regret, but of defiance, a cry that shook the beams of the cabin. It was the sound of a woman declaring she had endured enough, a voice that had been silenced for years now roaring free. For the first time, Agnes wasn't reacting to Mason's will, she was acting for herself. The air felt lighter, almost sacred, as if the chains that bound her spirit had fallen away. To the entrepreneurs, freelancers, and creators watching, Agnes's act is a testament to the power of standing up, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Like you, she faced a system designed to crush her, but in that moment, she chose to fight for her worth. Her story challenges us to ask, what would you do when pushed to the edge, when silence is no longer an option? In the quiet that followed Gerald Mason's collapse in that Virginia kitchen in the winter of 1850, the world seemed to hold its breath. Agnes stood motionless, her heart pounding like a war drum, the knife now a silent witness on the floor. The plantation, once ruled by Mason's iron will, stirred with a new kind of energy as the news of his death spread faster than the morning frost could melt. By noon, whispers had raced beyond the wooden fences of the estate, carried on the lips of workers, neighbors, and passers-by. "Agnes killed him!" Some murmured in disbelief, their voices trembling with shock. Others, Their tones hushed but edged with a dangerous pride, said. She struck back. For the enslaved community, Agnes's act was no mere moment of violence. It was a spark in the darkness, a defiant flare that illuminated the possibility of resistance. To them, it wasn't just a master's death. It was a crack in the chains that bound them all, a fleeting glimpse of what courage could do. The impact rippled through the quarters, where men and women who had toiled under Mason's cruelty felt the weight of Agnes's choice. Around flickering fires that night, some wept quietly, mourning the inevitable fate that awaited her, while others prayed her courage would linger like a flame that refused to die. Younger voices, restless and bold, carried her name like a banner in their hearts, though they dared not speak it where overseers might hear. Her act was a mirror, reflecting their own scars, their own silenced dreams. For the enslaved, Agnes's defiance was proof that they were not powerless, that even in the face of whips and chains, a single act could shake the foundations of oppression. It was a fragile, forbidden hope, but it burned brightly in the shadows. Her story wasn't just news, it was a call, a reminder that the human spirit could still rise, even under the weight of unimaginable suffering. The reaction from the plantation's overseers and neighboring masters was swift and fierce, their fear masquerading as outrage. To them, Agnes's act was not just murder, it was rebellion, a dangerous signal that threatened their entire system. If one woman could raise a knife against her master, who else might dare to dream of freedom? They tightened their grip, barking harsher orders, wielding their whips with renewed venom, desperate to crush any spark of defiance before it could spread. Yet, the harder they tried to erase Agnes's act, the more her story took root. In the quarters, her name became a whispered prayer, a symbol of what could be done when silence turned to strength. For every lash they delivered, for every threat they shouted, Agnes's defiance loomed larger, a quiet challenge to their power that no amount of violence could silence. Agnes did not run. When the men came to seize her, they found her seated calmly in the kitchen, her hands folded in her lap, the knife untouched on the floor. The silence in the room was heavier than Mason's lifeless body, now carried away. Shackles snapped around her wrists, biting into skin already scarred, but Agnes walked steadily, her head held high. Neighbors and workers gathered, some watching with fear, others with contempt, but Agnes's gaze cut through them, fixed on a horizon beyond their judgment. Her arrest was quick, almost mechanical, as if the system knew exactly how to handle such a breach. Yet, even in chains, Agnes carried an unshakable dignity, her silence not a surrender but a refusal to bow. To the enslaved who caught glimpses of her as she was led away, she was no longer just Agnes, she was a vision of courage, a woman who had dared to act when all seemed lost. The courthouse in Prince William County was a cold, imposing space, its wooden benches filled with white faces stern with judgment. Agnes's trial was less a pursuit of justice than a ritual to restore order. The judges saw her not as a woman but as property that had defied its place. No jury debated her fate, no lawyer rose to defend her. The proceedings were a formality, a performance to cloak vengeance in the guise of law. When questioned, Agnes offered no plea, no tears, no apologies. Her silence was not empty. It was defiance, louder than any words she could have spoken. To the judges, it was insolence. To the enslaved who stood at the back of the room, it was strength. The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the courtroom, pronouncing her sentence, death. Yet, even as the verdict was read, it was Agnes's unbowed presence that lingered, her silence a thunder that drowned out the court's hollow justice. For the men who ruled Virginia's plantations, the sentence was a balm, a reassurance that their world of whips and ledgers would endure. But for the enslaved, it carried a different weight. Agnes's act had torn back the veil, exposing the raw violence that propped up slavery. Her death sentence was not just punishment, it was proof of the system's cruelty, laid bare for all to see. In the quarters, her name became a secret hymn, spoken in whispers to keep it alive. Some feared to speak of her, worried that overseers would punish them for honoring a condemned woman. Others clung to her story, repeating it like a sacred text, ensuring it would not fade. She did not bow, they said, their voices low but fierce. Agnes's execution loomed, but in her final days she remained composed, her spirit unbroken by the rope that awaited her. To the entrepreneurs, freelancers, and creators watching, Agnes's story is a powerful reminder of what it means to stand up against overwhelming odds. Like you, she faced a system designed to keep her small, to silence her voice. Her act of defiance, though it cost her life, was a declaration of worth, a refusal to let her humanity be erased. For those building businesses or chasing dreams, her legacy challenges you to ask, what does it mean to fight for your place in a world that tries to deny it? Agnes's story lives on, not in the details of her trial or the gallows, but in the truths she revealed, that even the most silenced voice can roar, and even the smallest spark can ignite change. As the gavel fell in that Virginia courthouse in 1850, Agnes's life was extinguished, her body erased from a world that sought to silence her. Yet, her story refused to die. In the quiet corners of slave quarters, her name became a whispered legend, passed from mother to daughter, from firelight to firelight, a testament to courage that no rope could strangle. Agnes was more than a woman who struck down her oppressor, she was a beacon of defiance, proof that even in the darkest chains, the human spirit could blaze. Her act, born of desperation and dignity, challenged the brutal machinery of slavery, forcing it to reveal its cruelty in stark daylight. Was her crime the knife she wielded, or the years of torment that drove her hand? That question lingered, haunting those who heard her tale, demanding they confront the true cost of a system built on stolen lives. For the enslaved, Agnes was a symbol that resistance was possible, that dignity could rise from despair. Her unmarked grave could not bury her legacy, which lived on in hushed stories, a spark that fueled dreams of freedom. For you, entrepreneurs, freelancers, and creators over 55, who've built lives on grit and vision, Agnes's courage mirrors your own battles against daunting odds. Keep her story alive. Subscribe to Murder Files TV, share this video, and honor the voices that history tried to silence.